A warm greeting to whom this class is addressed to. I hope that the content of this talk will be of interest to the exciting synodal journey that with hope we have only begun. My name is Carlos García de Andoin, and I speak as a layman married with 2 children from the Diocesan Institute of Theology and Pastoral of Bilbao in the Basque Country in Spain. This topic, which will encompass synodality, democracy, and parliamentarism, is within the second week, decision-making in the Church of this class of community discernment and decision-making in a synodal church. It will try to clarify the relations between synodality, democracy, and parliamentarism. 3 budgets, that's how it starts. First, the Church has an original identity, so it is not appropriate to mimetic transfer the civil democratic form to the Church. Second, the Church can learn from democratic experience and from the responses that societies have given to the issue of power, forms of government, and citizen participation. And third, the Church has made and can make more unique contributions to democracy in forms and political culture. I will develop my contribution in 10 points, and I will share a PowerPoint so that the conference can be. In the first point, will be the synodal church, credible subject and reliable partner of democracy. Second, the appreciation of the church for political democracy. Third, base reservations towards democracy as a benchmark of eclesial governance. Fourth, the true form of the organization of the church, the patriarchal government of view. Fifth, communion does not mean less democracy. Sixth, the consultative participation of the laity in the decision-making. Seventh, for a deliberative and decisive participation, also in the decision-taking. Eighth, differential spiritual quality of common discernment. 9, consensus culture and the rule of majority, created by the monks. 10th, as conclusion, train capacities for synodal discernment. I will start with the first one, the synodal church, credible subject and reliable partner of democracy. There are those who contrast evangelization and synodality, saying the challenge is evangelization, and let us stop with internal things. However, there is no real opposition in the synodal reform. The sacramentality of the Church is at stake, and the credibility of the Lord Jesus Kerygma is also at stake in open and democratic societies. Synodality has much to do with evangelization. Secondly, synodality has among its objectives, in addition to making the Church a credible subject, to make her a reliable partner in the face of common challenge of the reconstruction of democracy in a context of structural crisis and distrust. Thirdly, the synodal life of the Church can be offered as an effective sign, as a diaconia for the promotion of peoples in terms of justice, solidarity, and peace. Second, the appreciation of political democracy. Christianity had a decisive contribution to the idea of individual freedom that placed limits on the divine right of kings. But the relationship of the Catholic Church in that scheme of throne and altar, that relationship of the Catholic Church outside of the scheme of the Asian regime with modernity, was characterized by anti-liberalism in the 19th century. The Second Vatican ended up reconciling the Church with the democratic system, recognizing that a legal political order based on democratic freedoms is more in accordance with human dignity. The Church had, in fact, a remarkable contribution from the 70s in the so-called Third Democratic Wave in Latin American countries, in countries of Southern Europe, and also in Eastern Europe. In Athens, still a few months ago, Francis notes the decline of democracy in the face of the easy promises of authoritarian populism. Faced with this situation, he reaffirms, in the face of this crisis of representation and disaffection towards political institutions, the call to deepen democracy, to move from partisanship to participation in the face of the situation of crisis of democracy, Francis proposes more democracy. We'll go with the third point, reservation towards democracy as a benchmark of eclesial governance. This support for democracy as a political system and its improvement coexists, however, with the reservations towards democracy as a benchmark of governance of the Catholic Church. The Vademecum, the preparatory documents for this first diocesan phase of the Synod, warns among several temptations about that of treating the Synod as a kind of parliament. It says that such a comparison confuses synodality with a political battle where to govern one side must beat the other. Also, in the preparatory questionnaire, pastors are told not to fear his synodal itinerary because consultation with the people of God does not imply that the dynamisms of democracy rooted in the principle of the majority are assumed within the Church. The fact is that there is a silence about the actual organization of the Church in the ecclesial discourse. If we stick to Aristotle's classification, which distinguishes between the government of one and of the few and of the many, the canonical model in the Church is the government of the one. The Code of Canon Law states that the Roman Pontiff, as Vicar of Christ and Pastor of the Universal Church, has supreme, complete, immediate, and universal power in the Church, which he can always exercise freely. However, if we look at the praxis of government of the Church, the actual organization may not be so much of an autocracy as what in a political theory we could call aristocracy or oligarchy. That is the government of a few that we may be able to identify with the clergy, but it can also be a group of bishops. All this depending on the context of relationships to which we are referring to. A patriarchal oligarchy, the power of government in the Church, is associated with, not with baptism, but with ordained ministry, and this is reserved for men and celibates. There is clear and systematic exclusion of women from the government in the Church, also of the married, and it is already affirmed that without parity in the challenge we set ourselves, there is no synodality. Communion does not mean less democracy. It is said that the Church is not not democracy but communion. They are two different terms, difficult to compare because they move on very different levels of language. In fact, in the Church, power comes from God. It does not have its origin in the people, and its standards is the gospel of Jesus Christ. No constitution at all, referendum, by means that it is approved, and in fact, in what is the Church, there is an original experience that is normative, the gospel of Jesus Christ. But if God is Trinitarian communion of love and service, if the Church is a sign and instrument of communion of the people of God, and all of her is saint, Catholic, and apostolic, what does not conform to her sacramentality is mimicry with monarchical absolutism. Democracy entails an anthropology of freedom, equality, and human fraternity, so that we can say that beyond the limits of analogy, it is certainly more in accordance with the Christian way of life. Communion is not democracy, but it is no lesser democracy, but much more than a democracy. We're going to delve into some implications in some concretions of the reflection of the debate in which we are immersed in this process of preparation of the synod. And it is the consultative participation of the laity in what is the elaboration of the decisions in the decision-making. When the government is led by one or only a few, what needs to be encouraged is participation of all. And this is precisely the participation of God's people founded on baptism. The International Theological Commission, in a very important document of 2018, Synodality in the Life and Mission of the Church, considers that a synodal church is a participatory and co-responsible church. What participation and co-responsibility do you assign to the laity? Consultation is attributed to it. The consultative vote, Batum Antum Consultivo. The consultation of all the faithful was a practice of the medieval church, based on a principle that would come from Roman law, which affects everyone, must be treated and approved by all. This applied without limitation to the three areas of church life: faith, sacraments, and government. The Theological Commission insists that the value of this consultative vote should not be underestimated. Consultation in the Synodal Assembly expresses the wishes, the vows of the faithful in a way that must be taken into account by the pastors. Canon law provides that in specific cases, pastor must act only after having requested and obtained the different opinions according to the legally determined formalities. Likewise, the example that when a superior needs consent and advice of a school or a cuitus, he must summon or consult him according to law, and for the act valid, he must have previously requested the opinion of all. Also, in the case of the Synod of Bishops, which is a consultative to the pontiff, it is considered that if his vote is morally unanimous, it carries a peculiar ecclesial weight that surpasses the merely formal aspect of the consultative vote. We must canonically recognize the right of consultation of the faithful. I believe that this is a very important step that needs to be implemented with procedures, in addition to consultative participation through individual vote or synodal body. Finally, it must prescribe canonically regarding which matters the pastoral ministry must consult the faithful. Undoubtedly, there is still a long way to go in what is consultative participation based on baptism. The Theological Commission stretches to the maximum the value of the consultative vote, but marks a limit to decision-making. This is used by the distinction in political theory of decision-making and decision-taking. It considers that it's up to the laity to participate in the elaboration of decision, but not to adopt it, which ultimately corresponds to the pastors. It states clearly, the elaboration is a synodal competence, the decision is a ministerial responsibility. The document points out that consultative participation should not be understood in the sense of the council itself, ecclesiological or of political parliamentarism, but in that of union with a hierarchical structure of a concrete regime of association and agreement, because the authority of pastor is not a delegated and representative function of the people. However, it argues that the proper governance function of pastors should not be separated from the community. It states there is no externality or separation between the community and its pastors, but a distinction of competences in the reciprocity of communion. If this is so, why stop participation of the laity in the decision-making if it occurs not in a self-convened assembly body, but in a synodal body that cannot be such if it's not presided with ministerial character? Let's move forward from this question with the next point, for a decisive and deliberative participation. It certainly participates in the church. There is still a path for the consultative participation of the laity in dioceses, parishes, and in the universal church. However, the experience of this form of participation of the laity, wherever it has occurred, is not entirely satisfactory. The parish and diocesan pastoral councils that emerged from the Second Vatican have not, in general terms, meant an experience of co-responsibility, as might be expected, of the ecclesiology of the people of God. Little or almost nothing of the fundamentals is consulted, and if there is disagreement between the pastor and the rest of the council, his decision is usually imposed by a system without the need for other arbitrations, and too often without even offering any justification or account. Accepting that synodality seeks the formation in combination of participation of all with the exercise of ministerial authority, and accepting that in the Church, in accordance with her identity and tradition, this synodal process must be carried out within a hierarchically structured community, not in assembly forms or in open opposition to the apostolic ministry. However, can there be a deliberative and decisive participation of the people of God of their bodies of co-responsibility? The answer is yes. There is no reason to limit the sensus fidelium to a consultative function, precisely because the pastoral ministry is not outside, but is part of the assembly or the synodal body. It is the participation of the synodal ministry in the synodal body that gives the whole of it decision-making capacity. It is the positive of the principle established by the International Theological Commission. It states a synod, an assembly, a council cannot make decisions without legitimate pastors. So if the pastors are part of it, and it is chaired by a synod, an assembly, a council, then they can make decisions. It is true that in the church, unlike the democratic political community, ministerial authority is not a delegated and representative function of the people, but is conferred by Christ upon the College of Bishops, presided over by the Pope, and so on through the principle of apostolic succession. But when this principle is understood from a synodal hermeneutic, it is the entire synodal body that is pierced by the principle of apostolic succession. Synodality is not a complement to hierarchical ministry, but a new way of understanding hierarchical ministry in the Church. It is, says the International Theological Commission, quoting Francis' words, the interpretative framework, synodality is the most appropriate interpretative framework to understand the same hierarchical ministry. From this perspective, the challenge is not to establish in principle the consultative nature of the entities or the participation of the laity, but the usual deliberative and decision-making nature of the same. This doesn't mean that it can decide whatever outside of the apostolic ministry, but the optics are radically different because apostolicity is distinguished from synodality, but is not separate from it. Consequently, what should be regulated in the first place are the competences of each body of co-responsibility or synodality. That is, what it can legitimately decide so that nobody can decide on what it does not have. In any case, to issue a counsel or a proposal or a recommendation, and secondly, on the anticipation that there will surely be conflicts between the synodal body and the presidency of the synodal body, the apostolic ministry establishes arbitration procedures or, where appropriate, conditions of validity of the decision at higher levels. This is what must be canonically foreseen. Let's go now, and we are already moving forward with what is the final stretch of this contribution. But this point, the differential, the spiritual quality of common discernment. After this set of reflection, it is pertinent to differentiate a parliament from a synodal assembly. Yes, but not because parliament cannot be a place of presence of the Spirit, or because it is synonym with battle, or because it uses the rule of majorities. Parliament is also, or should be, the place par excellence where citizen participation resonates, the place of deliberation for the common good, the main channel for building the general will and a national community, even if there is bad praxis. So what sets it apart? A synodal assembly is in response to the Lord's convocation, not so a parliament. It should always be an exercise in communal listening to what the Spirit says to the churches through the Word of God, not so a parliament. It must always be an interpretation of the signs of the times in today's world from the believer's reading, not so a parliament. The synodal church, when summoned, is to pray, to listen, to analyze, to dialogue, and ultimately to discern the pastoral decisions most in accordance with the will of God. Francis, when he affirms that the synod should not be a parliament, says precisely that what differentiates it, that is a path of spiritual discernment, of ecclesial discernment, that is carried out in adoration, in prayer, in contact with the Word of God. It is its openness to the Word and to the guidance of the Spirit that it differentiates it from a parliament. Antonio Spadaro at the Civiltà Cattolica gives really significant keys to the points we raise. He says of Francis that his idea of reforming the Church corresponds to the Ignatian vision. He understands that structural reforms are necessary, but he's concerned that in the spirit of them is the witness of life and spiritual life. These are the guarantee of veracity of a reform of structures, because for Francis, reform is a truly spiritual process. Bergoglio is inspired by Jesuit Saint Peter Faber, for whom inner experience, dogmatic expression, and structural reform are intimately linked. According to this vision, Francis shuns reform as an ideology. He understands it as a spiritual process that starts from the emptying of oneself in the manner of the Messiah, Jesus, who despite his divine condition did not flaunt it, but emptied himself and took the condition of slave. Without this emptying, reform would not cease to be another ideology of change. Spadaro says that the Ignatian vision is in favor of change of structures by connaturality. From this horizon, discernment is the systematic structure of the reform. Francis is not a supporter of discernment on ideas, but on what's real, on stories. The starting point is always historical. Actions and decisions must be accompanied by a meditative and prayerful reading of experience, and the life of the Spirit has its own criteria. Thus, when a reform proposal is made, for Francis, not only the proposal itself is important, but also the good or bad spirit that carries it forward. In this sense, referring to the Synod for the Amazon, on the proposal of the priestly ordination of the Viri Probati, Francis wrote, there was a discussion, a rich discussion, a well-founded discussion. But without discernment, it is something different from reaching a good and justified decision by consensus or relative majority. He continued, we must understand that is the Synod, that the Synod is more than a parliament, and in this specific case, it could not escape this dynamic. On this issue, it has been a rich, productive, and even necessary parliament, but no more than that. For me, this was decisive in the final discernment when I thought about how to translate the exhortation. Therefore, the ordination of the Viri Probati, as is known, despite having obtained the necessary votes, was finally not approved in beloved or Masonia, querida Amazonia. What did deliberation lack to be a proper discernment? According to this explanation, for a true discernment, two attitudes are necessary. The emptying of oneself in the search for the will of God, and the way in which deliberation is carried out, whether it builds communion or provokes division in the Church. Both indicators qualify discernment, that is, if the deliberation is inspired by the Spirit. When a discussion is raised in terms of antagonism and entrenchment, is the truth of each one, it does not obey a discernment in the Spirit of God. Francis did not find, according to the Spirit, to reduce and divide the Synod Hall into dialectical and antagonistic positions that in no way help the mission of the Church. I insist, because everyone who entrenches himself in his truth ends up being a prisoner of himself and his positions, projecting his own confusions and dissatisfactions in many situations. In this way, journeying together becomes impossible. In conclusion, the differential of a synodal assembly with respect to a parliament is related to the spiritual quality of common discernment. That is, fidelity to the reality illuminated by the Spirit, prayerful listening to the Word, and fraternal listening to the community, mutual listening, the willingness to renounce one's own truth, to empty oneself, and the construction of communion in the process of deliberation and decision. Let's go to point 9 before we come to the conclusion. The culture of consensus and majority rule. Certainly, deliberation in the Church must seek the characteristic of synodal discernment mentioned. This requires an atmosphere of mutual listening and sincere disposition to personal change, renouncing the pretense of truth, characteristics we talked about. Under these conditions, the ideal is the adoption of decisions by consensus. However, according to the example of what happened in Amazonia, according to Francis, there is a certain risk that a blocking minority can always abort any change or reform. Certain decisions require consensus, and the effort of consensus must be made. But many others, the Church should not fear majority rule. In fact, it is usually practiced in the College of Cardinals for the election of Pope. Recourse to majority rule is also common in bishops' assemblies. It is appropriate to remember that it was the monks who inaugurated the majority voting rules. In Greece, for the election of positions, notary was used. Subsequently, when the hereditary principle could not be used, the criterion of unanimity was used. It was in the High Middle Ages when in the election of abbot, the religious orders inaugurated the electoral technique of the majority vote. As the political scientist Sartori says, the secret ballot and the elaboration of the majority voting rules are due to the boldness of the monks. It was not until the 17th century that John Locke postulated the rule of majority voting as a principle of election in the civil sphere. The culture of consensus is a requirement for the majority that must be inclusive. It must also be contained, it must be moderated, and it also be inclusive for minorities. When, after extensive deliberation, a decision is supported by a clear and reinforced majority, the minority must learn to accept the result with tolerance and obedience. We often simply identify democracy with majority rule. However, democracy is not simply majority rule. In fact, it develops numerous counterweight mechanisms to limit precisely any abusive or arbitrary exercise of majority power. It should be noted that, in the case of the Church, the dangers of excess of power do not come from the dreaded tyranny of the majority that Alexis de Tocqueville said, but from the proper of the one or the few. So the perspective of systems of control and counterweight must mainly be established not with respect to majorities, but with respect to a certain minority, he concluded. Training the capacities for synodal discernment. The itinerary opened by the synod can and should be an opportunity for training in the necessary demanding competences that are for synodal discernment throughout the body of the Church, in head and members, leaders and members. It is a question of embarking on a path of Church in a state of permanent reform that will have to face nothing more and nothing less than a synodal conversion. This is a transformation of the model of co-responsibility and governance in the Church of the third millennium. It is about inverting the pyramid. This requires new instruments and procedures, new canonical provisions, institutional legal reforms, but conditionally attitudes and a spirituality for synodal discernment, whose preparation we cannot delay. With this, I conclude, and allow me to thank you for your attention. And I invite you to contemplate these flowers, this blooming, blossoming from synodality in spring. Thank you.